and it formed the loess soils of northern Brittany, and they are very rich indeed, and that means the land is productive. So the land can contain large communities of people. And I think that is one of the reasons why we have such a rich culture in this area. I suppose it starts, of course, with hunter-gatherers, people who were foraging on the beaches, foraging in the forests, and following herds of animals and so on, collecting berries, collecting nuts. But then in the Neolithic period, we're talking about the middle of the 6th millennium BC, we know that farmers moved into Brittany, and they moved probably from two different directions. One lot of farmers moved up from the estuary of the Grande along the coast and settled on the south coast and then moved inland. And another lot of farmers had moved through the great river valleys of Europe into the Seine Valley, and from the Seine westwards and into Brittany. So that we have the coalescence of farming groups, bringing knowledge of domesticated animals and domesticated crops. And from that moment onwards, we find sort of settled economies and people able to stay in their landscape, not move too far from it, and therefore make a greater and greater impact on the landscape by building great monuments. Go on. One of the great monuments, one of the greatest in this area, is of course the great chambered tomb of Barnenes near Morlaix. It's world famous. I remember when Pierre Roland Gillot excavated it. He came to Britain and gave lectures on it, and I was at one of the first lectures he gave in Cambridge. It was remarkable. We just could not believe the wonders that he had found there. And what it is a chambered tomb where people made collective burials. Now, before that, burials were in chambers and closed in, and therefore not accessible. But in these tombs like Barnenes, we call them passage graves, it was possible to revisit the dead people, because the tomb itself was joined by a passage to the outside world, so that perhaps when another member of the family died, the tomb could be opened and the other member could be put in. And what is remarkable about Barnenes is that it has many of these chambered tombs within it. It's a huge mound which dominates the landscape as well. I think if you were sailing in to the estuary of the river of Morlaix, you would see it dominant in the landscape. It would be like a monument to ancestors, the people of that landscape saying, here are our ancestors, we are proud of them, this is for you to see. And also monuments of that kind, I think, would be the places where the history of the tribe would be sort of encapsulated, where perhaps grandfathers might take their grandchildren and explain, there is the tomb of your great uncle, and there is the tomb of your distant ancestor, and these people did these things. It would be a memorial to the history of the tribe. And that was built sometime in the 5th millennium BC, very early on. And these passage graves, I think, are particularly interesting. Until comparatively recently, archaeologists have said the idea of the passage grave began in Iberia, began in Portugal or Spain, and then spread along the Atlantic seaways to Brittany, and then from Brittany north to the Irish Sea, to Britain and Ireland. But recently, Scandinavian archaeologists have looked at all the evidence and have said, no, it is probably in Brittany. It is probably in Brittany that these passage graves developed, the idea developed, probably in the Morbihan, and then spread very quickly to other parts of Brittany. So that one could imagine that wherever you have one of these great graves, you have the sort of centre of a small tribal group. And that's probably the story of the Tregor, a number of these tribal groups with their family monuments, creating the sort of focus of the well-being of the people. After this, of course, Brittany becomes very important as a source of metal, and in the metal industry, as it were. Now here, almost certainly, it was prospectors coming from the Lisbon area, from Portugal perhaps, looking for copper, working copper, one of the first metals to be used. And they came to Brittany, bringing with them what we call the maritime bell beaker culture, which is a very distinctive set of burial material, including these beautiful beakers that are made of pottery and decorated and red shiny pots, very, very dramatic pots. And these were developed in Lisbon area and are found on the south and north coast of Brittany, and represent the arrival of metal workers. And these metal workers went on from Brittany to Ireland, and we can discover them at a place called Ross Island in Ireland, and they were working the local copper there. And really, from then on, northern Spain and Brittany and southern Britain, including the southwest of Britain, Wales and Ireland, were all part of a rich metalworking tradition. And it was there that in the west of Europe, it was there that bronze developed. That is the addition, the alloying of copper and tin in a regular sort of percentage, usually about 11% tin and 89% copper. And that is an amazing technological discovery. That took place somewhere in this zone where people were constantly in contact. So once these metalworking communities had developed connectivity that bound these peninsulae, of which Brittany is one, together, then people were tended to be far more mobile. And in Brittany, you had the development of tombs of the early Bronze Age, which had, there's one near Lannion, for example, had gold and other items in rich items. And these tombs were single burials, barrows of rich people. In Britain, in around Stonehenge, you also get a similar development of these rich tombs at the same time, and it's quite clear that the two communities were in contact. Northern Brittany, this part of Brittany, in contact with across the water Wessex, the southern coast of Britain. And we know this because one of the things being made in this part of Brittany was a bronze short dagger with a handle of wood, but inset with little pins of gold, so it shone. And these daggers are actually found in the graves in Wessex near Stonehenge, and they must have been imported from Brittany to Wessex. And similarly, what they were doing in Wessex near Stonehenge was making items of gold and decorating them with sort of linear decoration. And one of those is found in the tomb near Lannion, this little gold box. So that must be a British product coming the other way. So we've got this toing and froing of people across the channel at that stage. Why they were doing it, difficult to know. One possibility is that they were visiting each other's sacred sites. Stonehenge is an obvious one, and it's probably a centre of pilgrimage. and it may well be people from Brittany were going there. And people from Britain were coming here. I wonder where they were going. Was there a great centre of pilgrimage somewhere in, say, the Mont d'Arrêt, where these tombs cluster? It's quite possible that there was, and we haven't yet found it. So pilgrimage, annual visits, social visits were the norm in this early Bronze Age. And so it goes on. The contacts along the Atlantic seaways develop, and Brittany always playing a crucial part in this, into the late Bronze Age, when we have what archaeologists called the Atlantic Bronze Age, because the whole of the swathe from Spain, including Western France, Britain, right up to the Shetland Islands, north of Scotland, all of that great swathe was bound together by people moving metals, moving either raw metal, copper, tin, or they were exporting or exchanging weapons and tools and armour. They had the same feasting equipment. It was, in many ways, you could say that perhaps someone from northern Brittany, someone from Tregor, going on a boat trip to Ireland or Scotland would find a very similar culture, and would probably be able to speak the language, because some of us believe that the language, that this connectivity in the late Bronze Age, sometime, say, 1200 BC to 800 BC, that was the time when the Celtic language really developed as a lingua franca, so that people could communicate along the Atlantic seaways. From then on, this connectivity really broke down somewhere about 800 BC. And we find that instead of being connected, all these places like Brittany or southern Britain and Ireland developed their own cultures rather separately, suggesting that people were no longer in quite the same sort of contact. And that may simply be because bronze was now being replaced by iron, and iron was far more discoverable in many parts of the world. You didn't need a lot of trade in iron, whereas you did need to trade extensively in copper and tin. Once iron took over, the need for trade broke down. So you get developing, Brittany develops its own very distinct culture in the Iron Age. In the Iron Age, Brittany develops its own very distinct culture with the famous standing stones, the stelae, that wonderful decorated one at Tregestelle, for example, and all around. There is one, I think, in Pleuler as well. But many of these standing stones, the souterrains, these underground storage chambers, and very distinctive pottery. So these communities were sort of rather interned at the beginning of the Iron Age. But when we get to the period, say, middle of the 2nd century BC, then a new connectivity develops. And it's probably the result of distant Roman trade beginning to impact in southern France. And this is the trade which saw particularly Italian wine being taken into southern France in great quantity, and slaves being exchanged for the wine. Diodorus Siculus, one of the contemporary texts, talks about this. He says of the Celts, they will give you a slave for an amphora of wine, exchanging the cup for the cup bearer, which is quite a nice sort of phrase. So we've got wine coming in these big amphorae into France and being traded all the way through France, along particularly the rivers. And one of the main trade routes was along the Aude, the Garonne, Gironde, and then the west coast of France, southern Brittany. And then these wine amphorae seem to have been traded both by sea around Brittany and by cross-peninsular routes using the rivers like the Leguer, for example. The river routes joining the south of Brittany to the north of Brittany. So a place like Leguer, just behind us here, on the mouth of the Leguer, was developed as a trading port where materials coming probably by river joined the maritime routes. And we know from these wine amphorae, the big jars, huge jars, that the wine was transported in. They're very distinctive. We find them here in Leguer, and we find them across the channel in the port of Hengistbury Head, which is in Dorset in southern Britain. And more to the point, we find in Hengistbury Head, which was a great port, we find Breton pots that were made in this area, in the Trégor, very distinctive black cordoned pots, which were traded along with the wine to southern Britain. And what was coming back from Britain, well, we know slaves was one thing, hunting dogs was another, metals, corn, grain, and hides. All of these things were being traded, so the classical writers tell us. So we must imagine from the mid-2nd century BC to mid-1st century BC, this very, very active maritime trade, joining Leguer, probably to Mountbatten near Plymouth and to Hengistbury Head, and from Saint-Malo, Alette, there was a similar place, joining the Channel Islands, again to Hengistbury Head. So networks of trade going across the Channel, and this part of Brittany becoming very important in that trade. And then, of course, we come to Julius Caesar, who smashes the whole thing up. In 56 BC, Caesar has arrived in Gaul in 59 BC. In 57 BC, he had negotiated peace with the tribes in this area. In the winter of 57-56, the tribes rebelled, and Caesar moved in the spring of 56 BC and conquered. Conquered Brittany and destroyed tribes like the tribal structure of tribes like the Veneti in the south. And he attacked the Corosolites, who are the tribe in this northern part of Brittany where we are. And it's quite possible that he attacked, or his armies attacked Leguer, the Iron Age fort here at the mouth of the Leguer. Very recently, a colleague of mine was looking at some of the artifacts which Patrick Galliot and I found when we excavated Leguer, and he reckoned that there were 2 pieces of Roman military equipment there, a spearhead and so on, and which might possibly be of Caesarian date. So it's just possible that sometime in the spring of 56 BC, there was a major battle on that hill just behind us, and the Romans took it from the native peoples. And then, of course, Roman Brittany, developed as part of the Roman province. Okay. One of the things that Roman rule brought was a degree of peace. After the battles and the early rebellions, most of Gaul and indeed Britain and other provinces settled down to a fairly longish period of reasonable stability and economic calm when they were able to develop. And we see that here with Roman villas developing, like the one not very far near Plestin on the coast, and Roman salt works develop around the coast, producing salt for making salt fish and salting fish and making fish sauce and so on. We know that they were growing, from our excavations here at Liode, that they were growing wheat and barley and oats in the landscape around. It was, looking at the culture of the cities and of the villas, it was clearly a rich and prosperous time for Brittany. But the Bretons still, I think, maintained a sense of their identity, because you find in many of the Roman villas in Brittany the use of seashells as decoration, seashells stuck in the plaster of the walls and painted. And that is something that is very rare in other parts of the Roman world, but very common in Brittany. It's almost the local community demonstrating its identity, demonstrating itself as different from the rest of the Romans. And also you get in Brittany these plaques of schist, a stone that can be carved, and often into carvings of sea creatures. And these decorated the villas. And that again is something very distinctive in Brittany that you don't get elsewhere. So each Roman province maintained an identity, and Brittany also maintained its identity, although it was part of the Roman world. It was integrated into the Roman world and functioned like any other province. And it really began to break down in the late 3rd century AD, when there were raids of barbarians crossing the Rhine frontier and pouring down into northern France and attacking by land and destroying some of the Roman cities. This is late 3rd century. And also at this time there were raiders coming by sea from Germany, from the mouth of the Rhine, that sort of area, coming into the North Sea and into the English Channel, and raiding both sides of the English Channel. And therefore, in both Britain and Brittany, the authorities had to develop new coastal defences, where they could station marines who could, if these pirates appeared in the sea, at sea, these marine groups could go out and attack the pirates and protect the land. And one of those sites, one of the naval bases, was at Alette, near Saint-Malo. One was here at Liode. They redeveloped the old Iron Age hill fort as a Roman base. Another was in Brest, for example. The great castellum at Brest originates as a Roman fort. So we've got now the local communities beginning to look after their own defence as the Roman Empire was beginning to break down. And you can see signs of stress, because there were many, many hoards of coins. People were burying their wealth in the late 3rd century. And the hoards are mainly found in the coastal regions of Brittany, suggesting that they were being attacked from the sea. And of course, in the 5th century, Roman rule broke down entirely. There seems to have been a decline in population in Brittany, as far as we can see. There's evidence from peat bogs, for example, where the pollen is preserved, that areas which had been farmed were going to waste and were going wild and growing woodland and so on. And this is in the late 3rd and 4th centuries. So some hints that the population was declining, as it was all over the Roman world. So you have threats from the sea, you have declining population, and that is the time when the Saxons from north of the Rhine frontier, coastal people from north of the Rhine frontier, began to attack Britain, and they attacked Normandy. So we've got Saxons settling in Normandy and in Britain, and this caused an upset of population, and people moved from the southwest of Britain, from Devon and Cornwall, probably Dorset, moved across to Brittany to settle with their compatriots here. And you remember that throughout the Iron Age and the Roman period, there had been this extensive trade between people in Brittany and southern Britain. Extensive trade, and there must have been intermarriages and so on. It was logical for people from being pushed out of southern Britain to move into Brittany, into parts of Brittany, and settle along with possibly their relations, distant relations, settle here in areas which had been abandoned for productive farming. And that is how, of course, some of the place names that you find in this area were introduced as part of that movement. These movements from southern Britain to Brittany are probably very, very complicated, and we can only guess at the causes. There was certainly massive pressure on the people in southwestern Britain. Pressure from Saxons coming across the North Sea into the east of Britain, pushing at them from the east, and also Irish moving from Ireland into Wales and into southwestern Britain. So you get pressure from two directions, and the only way that the southwestern Britons could move would be south to Brittany. So there is a push effect. But I think there was also a pull effect, that they had social relationships with Brittany, probably relations, intermarriages had gone on, so they would be known to each other. And also there is this evidence that parts of Brittany were certainly depopulated, or becoming depopulated in the 4th and 5th centuries. So there would be land to spare. So instead of, there would be a migration rather than an invasion. I think people were migrating and joining their relations here and taking up spare land, perhaps. And there is very little evidence, there is some, but very little evidence that there was any aggression. It seems to have been largely a friendly event, and but I mean, I think we must see that event in this great long delay of history, that the two sides of the Channel, the Brittany and southern Britain, were always in contact, were always exchanging ideas, exchanging populations, exchanging goods, that they habitually were in contact. And this movement of Britons to Brittany, whatever the size of that movement was part of the long history of the area. Now, I think that one of the things we need very much to know about this, it's a very interesting phenomenon, is what was the intensity of the movement. And historical studies, archaeological studies cannot really tell you that. But what can is ancient DNA, the study of the DNA of our ancestors. And I think that it would be possible for us to establish a research program between Brittany and Britain, looking at the populations, the cemeteries and so on of this crucial contact period, and checking the ancient DNA of the two populations. And then the geneticists would be able to tell us in detail, that was statistically testable, what the sort of numbers of people coming over were, and how they integrated and so on. And until we've done those studies, I think the questions will still be unanswered.